Welcome to Echo No More, clear, credible, court-ready documentation in high-conflict parenting. No hype, no legal jargon, no drama. I'm Dr. James. If you're new here, I'm really glad you found this space. This podcast is for protective parents navigating high-conflict custody situations, especially when the other parent is manipulative, emotionally unsafe, or unpredictable. I'm not a lawyer, and this podcast isn't legal advice. What I am is a parent who has lived through this system, and someone whose attorneys over and over again told me the same thing. Your documentation is excellent. They told me it made their job easier. They told me it protected my credibility. And they told me it changed how my case was received. That's why I'm sharing this. Not to teach you how to fight, but how to document calmly, clearly, and in a way courts actually understand. This is parent to parent, calm, grounded, and focused on protecting your child without losing yourself. This episode is one many parents don't expect. And if I'm being honest, it's one many parents resist at first. Because when you enter any legal or custody-related process, you're told very clearly, document everything, write it all down, keep records, track patterns. And that advice is not wrong, but there is an unspoken assumption underneath it that more documentation is always better, that the safest thing you can do is never stop. So, when I introduce the idea of pausing documentation, it can feel uncomfortable, even reckless. Parents often ask, what if I stop and something happens? What if this was the moment that mattered? What if the one thing I don't write down is the thing I later need? Those fears are real. They make sense because when you've been in a situation where you've had to prove reality, where your experience has been questioned, documentation becomes more than a tool. It becomes a sense of control, a sense of protection. But here's the truth that most parents are never told. Documentation that never pauses often stops being effective. Not because documenting is wrong, but because it slowly shifts from observation into vigilance. And vigilance has a cost. Let me ground this right away. Stopping documentation does not mean abandoning your child, ignoring risk, or pretending things are fine. Stopping documentation means choosing restraint, when restraint actually strengthens your position. There are specific moments when continuing to document actively hurts more than it helps. And knowing when to stop is part of doing this well. So, let's first talk about the reality of patterns don't need endless proof. Here's the first shift that parents need to understand. Once a pattern is clearly established, you do not need to record every repetition. In fact, this surprises people. Recording every repetition can actually weaken your case. Because courts are not looking for volume. They are looking for clarity, consistency, and credibility. They don't need 10 versions of the same interaction. They need to see this happened repeatedly, this follows a pattern, this has impact. Once that's clear, more entries don't really add strength, they add noise. And too much noise can dilute what actually matters. Second reality, repetition signals completion. Here's a practical way to recognize this point. If your entries start sounding the same, that's often your signal to pause. If you're writing the same descriptions, the same concerns, the same emotional impact over and over again, that usually means the pattern is already visible. At that point, continuing to log every instance doesn't increase credibility, doesn't improve clarity. It just increases your workload. And drains your energy. And that matters more than most parents realize. Third reality, your nervous system is part of this. So there's also a nervous system component here that is often overlooked. Documentation is meant to support you, but if you notice it starting to feel compulsive or urgent or hard to step away from, that's important data. If you feel like I have to write this down right now or I want to be able to relax, that's not documentation anymore, that's vigilance. And vigilance over time leads to burnout, emotional exhaustion, and reduced clarity. You start documenting everything instead of documenting what matters. And when everything is documenting, nothing really stands out. Fourth reality, resolution matters more than continuation. So another moment where stopping is not only appropriate but actually strategic is when something improves and stays improved. Parents often feel like they need to keep documenting just in case, but courts don't evaluate problems. They evaluate responsiveness, adaptability, and accuracy. If something resolves and you continue documenting it as if it hasn't, it can create a disconnect. It can make it appear like you're not updating your perspective, you're holding on to old narratives, or you're unable to recognize change. Letting documentation reflect improvement actually strengthens your credibility because it shows you are not invested in conflict. You are invested in accuracy, and that distinction matters. Fifth reality, documentation is not a scoreboard. Now, I want to speak directly to something many parents feel but don't always say out loud. There's this fear that sounds like, if I stop documenting, the other parent wins. That belief is incredibly common, and it keeps parents stuck in constant recording. But documentation is not a competition. It's not about who has more entries, who has thicker files, or who can produce the most detail. It's about who can present patterns clearly when it actually matters. So stopping documentation at the right time does not erase what you've already recorded. Your record doesn't disappear. It doesn't weaken. In many cases, it becomes stronger because it shows restraint. And restraint signals regulation, and regulation signals credibility. Sixth reality, when your life starts shrinking, it's time to pause. This is one of the most important indicators. If you find that documentation is starting to take over your mental space, if you're constantly thinking about the next entry, if you're replaying interactions to decide whether they count, if you're analyzing tone, wording, timing after every exchange, if you're struggling to be fully present with your child, that's not sustainable. And more importantly, it's not necessary. Because protecting your child also means protecting your ability to parent. If documentation is costing you presence, patience, or emotional availability, then the cost has become too high. And continuing at that level does not help your case. It hurts it. Seventh reality, summaries are much more powerful than constant entries. This is where many parents find relief. Once you've established a record, you don't have to keep documenting moment by moment. You can step back and begin to summarize. Summaries allow you to capture patterns, track changes, and maintain clarity without staying activated in every interaction. For example, instead of logging every single incident, you can document, over the past 3 weeks, communication has remained inconsistent, with repeated delays and lack of response impacting scheduling. That's clear, that's structured, and that carries more weight than 10 scattered entries. Eighth reality, documentation is adaptive. I want to be very clear here. Stopping documentation does not mean you will never document again. It means you shift from reactive documentation to intentional documentation. You can always restart, you can always resume. If a new pattern emerges, you document it. If something escalates, you document it. This is not all or nothing. This is adaptive, and adaptation is a strength. Final perspective. Discernment is what courts trust. The parents whose documentation courts trust the most are not the ones who write constantly. They are the ones who demonstrate discernment, who shows they know when something matters, they know when something is repetitive, and they know when to step back. That communicates something powerful: stability, clarity, and emotional regulation. And those qualities, they carry weight. So, let me say this directly, because many parents need permission to hear it. You are allowed to live your life between entries. You are allowed to stop watching constantly. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to trust what you've already recorded. The record will still hold. Before we close, I want to remind you of something important. You don't need to document everything, you don't need to be perfect, and you don't need to convince anyone with emotion. Calm documentation is power. If this episode helped you, you will find a full structured system in my guide, Clear, Credible, Court Ready. It's designed to support, not replace, your attorney. And if you want help turning everything you're documenting into something organized and usable, you can visit www.economocoaching.org to download my guide on how to create a clear, court-ready documentation binder. Take what helps, leave what doesn't, and most of all, take care of yourself. I'll see you next week.